Support for the Brewlosophy podcast comes from the following. Love to Brew is a national leader in homebrewing supplies, offering exclusive products such as East Coast yeast, TV taps, and Brewlosophy recipe kits, all with free shipping on orders over $75. When you need brewing ingredients or equipment, check out Love to Brew at love2brew.com. The best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Find everything from classics to modern favorites, as well as cool experimental varieties and a vast array of ingredients and gear at yakimavalleyhops.com. Hey everybody, before we get started, I've got something cool to tell you about. The folks over at Brew Your Own magazine, who've been providing homebrewers with some of the best brewing information for over 20 years, is offering fans of Brewlosophy a killer deal. For a limited time, new subscribers who use the link provided at brewlosophy.com/BYO will get their first year for half off. That's 8 issues for $14.99, less than $2 a piece. Now, this offer ends on August 12th, so don't hesitate. Go subscribe ASAP. With fantastic articles written by the likes of Gordon Strong, Michael Tonsmeyer, John Palmer, and many more, a subscription to BYO Magazine is sure to help any homebrewer on their path to crafting great beer at home. Again, to get your first 8 issues for only $14.99, you must use the link provided at brewlosophy.com/BYO by August 12th. I've been a subscriber for years and still look forward to every new issue, usually plowing through them the night they arrive. Cheers to BYO for offering this awesome discount. Don't miss out. Hey everybody, I'm Marshall Schott.
I'm Ray Found.
And this is the Brewlosophy Podcast. The main topic of today's show is everybody's favorite flower, hops. In particular, the amount used to dry hop beer.
Yeah, we're going to check out that all-important characteristic of an IPA, what that dry hop does to the final character, especially the aroma of our India Pale Ales.
You know, this is one of those things that I've been thinking about a lot since we settled on making this the topic of the show, because it kind of reminded me of the very first IPA I ever brewed way back in 2003. This is when IPAs were nowhere near the way they are today, at least by my recollection. Back then, the beer that I designed ended up having, I think it was hopped at 60 minutes with like 2 ounces of Chinook or something like that. And, the IBUs, at least predicted by whatever I was using back then to predict IBU, was something like 145, I think. And that was the whole point, right? Make it as bitter as possible to prove to your friends that you could drink a bitter beer. And I'm telling you right now, there was 0 dry hop. I have the recipe for it still to this day. I didn't even know what a dry hop was when I was designing that recipe.
I got to tell you, Marshall, it doesn't sound good.
It was not good back then. And I'll tell you what, I had a buddy who I introduced to homebrewing, back in 2010 or so, who he wanted to brew an IPA. And so I was like, oh yeah, I've got this recipe that I designed back in 2003. Here, I email him the recipe and he brewed it up and we tasted that thing together. And it was the same. It was exactly what you would expect. Completely this bitter bomb that we pretended to enjoy, just because it was homemade. But it was definitely did not have the aroma that we expect from today's pale ales and IPAs. And that's really what we expect to get out of a dry hop, right? Is that kind of aromatic quality from the hops.
Yeah, I think it's that aroma and the richness of that sort of varietal character that you get out of the hops that sort of defines the modern IPA.
Yeah.
More so than any intensity of bitterness or harshness or anything like that seemed to be more common even just 6 or 8 years ago.
Yeah. It's interesting to witness the evolution of the IPA and where it's coming. I remember drinking at a local brewery up in Bellingham, Washington, and they had an IPA on, and I remember the bitterness just being so... that was like the main feature of the beer. And these days, it almost seems like brewers, whether it's professional or at home, work towards producing these IPAs with all of the hop character in the nose and in the flavor, but really not much bitterness at all. So it's really interesting. Well, in honor of today's topic, I don't know about what you're drinking, but I've got a Firestone Walker Easy Jack, one of my favorite. Is session IPA still a thing? I don't know, but one of my favorite low alcohol hoppy beers that I'm sure is dry hopped quite liberally. Delicious beer.
Yeah, and I'm drinking this is actually my take on a recipe of Brian Hall's. His somewhat internet famous Alohops, which combines that Hawaiian tropical spirit with a modern IPA, specifically a New England style, although mine isn't quite as New Englandy, maybe as some would prefer. But it's a tremendous beer, super aromatic, really intense Citra note to it, and just a delicious beer. No caramel malt. It's just awesome.
You just had the opportunity to visit Brian up in his homeland of Alaska, right?
Yeah, it was awesome. He hiked circles around me. We had some beers. We had some pizza. A great dude. Makes a wicked pizza. And some pretty good beers, too. We actually went to a homebrew club meeting up there with him, and he and I, in the process, conspired to win the Alaskan Brewing Company's homebrew competition this fall. So if anybody out there was planning on entering, you might as well skip it. Brian and I have a combined experience, I think, of 0 beers ever brewed with the feature ingredient of spruce tips. So it's pretty much a guaranteed victory for us.
Yeah,
and
right.
It's going to be awesome. So just save your entries till next year.
Yeah. Well, I've had the opportunity to hang out with Brian for a while. In fact, Brian and I first, met online, of course, when he was living in Maine a couple of years ago. And Nick Impellitteri from the Yeast Bay was looking for some beta testers. And Brian Hall, myself, and Ed Coffey were the 3 that he ended up selecting. And, Brian and I kind of forged a cool relationship from there. And then we met up at the last few homebrew cons / NHCs. And like you said, just an awesome guy, somebody who really cares about brewing, and I think really is kind of shares our passion for exploring this thing that we love so much without being too overly invested, at least to the point of not testing things out. We want to test things out. And because of that, I'm super stoked to announce that the next new contributor to Brewlosophy is going to be Brian Hall. Yay!
Yay!
He's such a cool guy. We've been talking about this for a while. In fact, he proposed the idea to me a couple months back, and of course, I was just thrilled that Brian, who I think has one of the cooler homebrewing blogs out there, he does a lot of stuff with food as well. I think he's inspired a lot of us in terms of the way we approach making pizzas and breads and stuff like that as well. Just a really great guy that I'm stoked to have on board. He's currently in the process of moving into his own home and all that. And so he'll be joining us slowly, but he'll definitely be coming on board, and you'll start to see some articles over at brewlosophy.com with his name on it. So everybody help us to welcome Brian Hall to the Brewlosophy crew. I'm really stoked about that.
Yeah, me too. Brian's awesome.
Yeah. Good guy. And he's funny, and he's tall. I mean, he's going to be the tallest. Well, him and Jake will be competing for the tallest member of the Brewlosophy crew.
No. Brian is much taller than Jake.
Yeah, he's like a giant, man. You'd think he was from Alaska or something. Well, hey, we don't really have a segment where we talk about beer news or other things going on in the craft beer world. Nothing like that. But as I trust anyone listening to this podcast has probably already heard, the Brewers Association recently did something that some might say, I don't know, is somewhat controversial.
I don't know if controversial's the word. I guess everything these days becomes controversial. They created this, if you'd call it a label or a certification or a stamp or something that a brewer can now put on their label to indicate that they're brewed by a independently owned, non-conglomerate controlled brewery. And some people find that, really important. Some people don't. But, they've come out with this new logo that says that it's a certified independent brewery. That I guess we'll start seeing on beer labels and tap handles and restaurant menus over the coming months and years. Yeah,
that's what it sounds like. The reason we're bringing this up, we're all on Facebook, we're all doing things on Twitter and stuff like that. It seems like I as invested as I am in the world of homebrewing, as much as I love craft beer, it seems like my opinion maybe isn't shared by people who like the same things I do. I'm not against the Brewers Association at all. I love the BA. And in fact, the AHA, which is an arm of the Brewers Association, they're our biggest primary sponsor over at brewlosophy.com. They really help us to continue bringing you guys this content. So, my opinions are in no way way, I don't know, a dig on the BA. But I'm just not as excited about this label as I feel like some people are, partially because I feel like it's just a really political ploy to kind of give big beer the bird. And that just doesn't fit with my kind of life philosophy. It feels kind of silly to me. It feels really divisive. And it seems like the whole thing is kind of aimed toward those people who don't really know that much about what's going on in the craft beer world anyways. And there's a part of that feels a little bit manipulative to me. I've talked to some people who are nowhere near as against this thing as I am, I guess. Then they see the point in it, and I can appreciate that. It's just such a weird thing to me that we have to put a label on beers now, like a mark is how I look at it, to kind of allow people who don't really feel like researching it too much themselves to know that, if I buy this one, well, I'm not supporting Satan, over here, BMC Satan. And I guess my point is I've never been anti BMC really anyways. If I go over to my neighbor's house and they offer me a can of Miller Lite or a Kerr's Banquet or something like that, you better believe I'm not going to scoff at them and try to teach them of the holy land of craft beer. No way. In the same way when they come over here and I pull them a tap off my kegerator, they may not even love it, but they're going to drink it because it's just a cool thing that you do. And I guess that's the part of it that bugs me a little bit about this whole labeling thing.
Yeah. I think it depends how it ends up getting used and how prevalent it becomes. Personally, I don't see it all that different from, say, the label that's put on beer that's certified Trappist, right? The Belgian beers that are Trappist, a Chimay, say, compared to a St. Bernardus, which is not a Trappist beer. It says nothing necessarily of the quality of the beer. It just speaks to the ownership and who holds that brewery, who owns that brewery.
Yeah,
in that sense, I think of it sort of as the same, of the same thing. And I don't know. For me, I disagree with you a little bit because I think it does fulfill a little bit of a market demand for some transparency that is certainly not volunteered from the macro companies.
Yeah, and there's no getting around that truth, right? Macro doesn't want you to know that they're, at least it seems, right, that the breweries that they own a stake in, they don't want you to know that they own that stake. They want it to look as crafty as other craft breweries. I get that, and I get that people want transparency. I guess I just feel like there's other ways we could potentially go about doing that don't feel so sticky icky to me. It just doesn't. This seems so weird. Maybe the word label is the fact that that's a part of it. And you brought up the Trappist thing, and I don't see it that way. The Trappist thing isn't the intent of that isn't to say, which people are going to argue with me on this, and I get that I'm in the minority here, and that's okay. People don't need to agree with me, but I think the intent of this label that the BA invented for craft or independent brewers to put on their bottles and on their kegs and on their tap handles, I think the intent is to so that people don't buy the other stuff. I think that is it, and that's fine. People don't want to buy it anyways. But if you're not informed enough to already know what's what. I don't know. It just feels so awkward to me now that we're going to be walking around in a world where independent beer has been so politicized as to have a label on the side of it, to prove that, hey, look at what I'm drinking here. And there's just a lot goes into it that I'm not a big fan of. Is it going to stop me from drinking independent beer? Of course it's not. And I think the biggest thing for me is, I'm not judging you for your hatred of Bud Miller Coors. And in the same way, chill out on people like me who enjoy having a Miller Lite when I get home from work. There's nothing about me enjoying that says that I can't properly enjoy a homebrewed beer or an independent beer from some great craft brewer. My favorite beer on earth I'm drinking right now is a Firestone Walker. They can do no wrong in my book. Doesn't mean I'm not going to drink a Miller Lite when my neighbor comes over and hands me one.
But I don't necessarily think that's I don't think it's to convince you that a Miller Lite isn't a craft beer. I think it's more like, I think of myself, I travel a lot for work, and I go into the local restaurant, in Washington State somewhere, and I order a beer, there's 2 IPAs on the, and I feel like an IPA tonight, and one is, from some brewery that's recently acquired by Budweiser, and the other is from a local, just down the street, small mom and pop shop. I would personally rather give my money, at least at first blush, I'd rather give that small family business a chance. And I think something like this has the opportunity to have a pretty substantial effect on some of those smaller businesses, while quite frankly having a fairly small effect on the big businesses. Like the tiny percentage differences that they're going to see, don't really make a big impact.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know. I think giving any advantage to the smaller businesses that are already somewhat disadvantaged with the 3-tier distribution system, I don't know. I'm kind of okay with it. I think the label's kind of ugly. Yeah, yeah. And I don't like labeling people or things or groups, but I don't know.
Yeah. It's, and the thing is, I have a feeling that the majority of people who are listening to this right now are going to agree with you, and that I'm probably going to get a little bit of shit for my opinions on this one. But I'll tell you what, if this ends up helping out, because I think if we distill this thing down, the idea here is that independent brewers, if that's what we're calling them now, benefit from it, right? Otherwise it makes no sense to do it. It's a waste of money, whatever, If there's some measurable way that they can prove that they have benefited from this label being on their, their bottles and kegs and whatnot, then you know what? I'll eat my words. That's great. I just don't think this is going to have the intended effect. And a part of me thinks that because I'm biased against labeling and doing all of this divisive stuff and whatever. But you know what? If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and I'll admit it. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to watch this over the next couple of years as we start to see what beers develop. I heard from somebody already once that by seeing that label, they're going to, someone who shares more of my opinions, a home brewer and a craft beer lover, that label is probably going to detract them from buying a certain beer because it just feels so weird. And that's so.
I don't know. I mean, I just hope. I guess my hope is that if that label helps the person who, comes to Southern California, comes to LA area, for a weekend trip, if that helps them to find and discover, Hangar 24 out in Redlands instead of Golden Road, which is a Miller Coors product in LA, I think that's a win. And I think that's a small business smaller. Hangar 24 has grown quite large, but they make great beer. And I don't know. I don't disagree that that's not a win. I mean, if it ends up working that way, I'm with you. It's a win. The way it was implemented, or the way it's so new, I guess we don't really know how exactly it's going to be implemented. And I don't want to look like the guy who's just dogging on new ideas because I like drinking Miller Lite. I mean, I don't care that much, but it does feel a little bit weird to me. And again, I'm curious to see how it ends up panning out. Well, all of that stuff said, I feel it's only appropriate that one of the most popular beers in America, everybody's favorite blue can Bud Light, receive a solid blind review.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. I like that this one looks like a beer. It's a color of beer.
It is a color of beer.
It's a color of beer. It's golden beery color. It has no smell. So it's going to be beer. I think it's going to be beer, dude. None of that hoity stuff.
We'll see.
Yeah. It's delicious.
Yeah.
Tastes like beer.
Easy going.
You know what this tastes like? Beer. I get a hint of beer. There's a taste of beer. I'm getting beer.
More beer.
Yeah, I'm getting beer. This could be Miller Lite. Is this Miller Lite?
It probably is.
You're not fooling anybody. Is this Miller Lite? This could be Miller Lite. This is delicious, dude. This tastes like everybody stopped caring about politics. It's just delicious.
It's no soap, no juniper.
No, it's just beer. I could shotgun this. If you hadn't handed it to me in this
baby cup,
hoity-toity baby cup,
I think I'm gonna shotgun it.
All right, let's do it. Me first.
You won.
That's delicious, dude. It's a Miller Lite.
I can drink this all day long.
It's Miller Lite. I could drink it. If this is a craft version of a normal beer, then we need to get a lot of them. I'm gonna drink those.
Whatever this is, I will drink the shit out of it.
Does it come in a can? Did you pour it from a can? If so, I love it even more.
Delicious.
I'd love to keep giving you my thoughts on it, but it's gone because I drank it because it was delicious.
Does the amount of hops used when dry hopping matter? That's going to be the focus. Stick around. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste time chilling work, which is why I use cleverly designed immersion chillers from Jaded Brewing. After some bad experiences with counterflow and plate chillers, I began the search for a more efficient chilling solution and discovered Jaded. That was nearly 4 years ago, and to this day, I continue to rely on the King Cobra and the Hydra to chill my wort in record time without the setup or cleaning hassle of other chillers. If you're looking for a way to optimize your brew day, I can't recommend Jaded chillers enough. Go see what they have to offer at jadedbrewing.com and let them know Brewlosophy sent you. All right, so we live in this day and age in the beer world where it seems like people are doing everything they can to pack as much hop aroma and hop flavor into their beer as possible, to the extent that they're spending, even homebrewers are spending upwards of $20, $25 on hops just for a 5-gallon batch of beer. I guess the question becomes, is it really making a difference, or is there that point where you're just wasting money? You're throwing hops at a beer and it's not really making much of a difference.
It certainly sounds like it's making a difference to people who sell hops.
Yeah, and we love those people, right?
Yeah, it's but that's sort of the question that we wanted to look into. I've been making IPAs for several years now, and a lot of the recipes I looked at had for a 5-gallon batch an ounce or two of dry hops, and when a 2-ounce package of this of a fancy hop might be, $5 or $7 at the local homebrew shop. That seemed like a pretty substantial impact.
The amount of hops that you were using had a substantial impact on the character of your beer, is what you're saying.
Well, at least on the pocketbook. I mean, that's what I was never really sure. And part of why I led to this experiment was, where is that point of diminishing returns? You'd often hear from people that, well, any more than pick your favorite number, 1, 2, 3, whatever ounces of dry hops in a 5-gallon batch was just throwing money away, and that there was no additional aroma being generated by that. And that was something I was always kind of curious about.
Yeah, likewise. It's kind of like this whole idea behind a saturation point, right? That once you get all that there is to get out of a certain amount of hops, you can, no matter what you end up throwing in to the beer after that point, it's only going to contribute something else, right? But not necessarily, you're not going to get any more hop oils out of your beer. I think back, I already told the story about that first IPA I ever made. And then, probably around 2010, 2011, I started getting interested in making more IPAs and pale ales that were dry hopped. I started to hear about these really aromatic pale ales that were being dry hopped. They just weren't the higher alcohol.
You mean session IPAs, as they're called today?
No, because I believe session is below 5%. Pale ales are typically like 5.5%, right?
Okay.
Oh Lord. But yeah. So, and I remember thinking like, okay, somebody had mentioned to me at one time that your dry hop, particularly in a pale ale, not so much an IPA, but the dry hop could be sort of like a ratio of all of the amount of other hops you use during the boil. And so I kind of stuck with that. And so if I used, 2 ounces in the boil, I was using something like 2.5 to 3 ounces in the dry hop, because of this weird ratio idea that I don't even remember where it came from. I was definitely on top of being, I think hops are, when you're making IPA and double IPA, hops are easily the most expensive part of your brew day. I was definitely curious about, what were the positive effects and the negative effects of maybe using too much dry hops. Obviously there's the negative of not using enough is that you just don't get that hop aroma and that hop flavor that we expect in today's style of IPA. But what happens when we over dry hop? Is there a point of where you're using too much and you're just starting to extract maybe that chlorophyll kind of flavor, that green, grassy thing, as opposed to all of the other flavors? I think some of the purported negative effects of dry hopping with too much. Stuff like, haze, right? There's polyphenols in hops, and the more hops you use in the dry hop, the more ostensibly polyphenol you're going to end up in your beer.
Very true. I mean, dry hop haze is a well-known phenomenon that I think, anybody who's brewing, especially IPAs or pale ales for any amount of time has at least experienced at some point, and generally attributed to dry hopping. It's probably one of the leading causes, although this is a whole other can of worms in terms of what causes the haze in the New England style IPA. So certainly dry hop doesn't help you make a crystal clear beer. It may hurt, but it certainly doesn't help.
That's true. And I think we've all experienced, I know personally, I've made a beer that I've, find with gelatin that maintains just kind of a permanent haze throughout its life, which I have to believe is contributed by the high amount of dry hop. Another concern that I've read about is that, again, that chlorophyll kind of vegetal character that you can get, if you were to chew on grass, something like that. Is that something you've ever experienced before?
This is one of those things that, and like many of the off flavors that you might find in how to brew or what have you, this is one I've never really experienced. I just haven't. I haven't tasted a beer that had a grassy note to it.
So I have plenty of times, and my presumption is always that it was at least back in the day, before some of the experiments and some of my own personal experiences with dry hopping with a ton of hops. I presumed that it was because of too many hops being left either in the kettle, right, and they were transferring kettle trub to the fermenter, or just over dry hopping, like this kind of attempt, this crazy attempt to get as much hop character in the beer as possible. I've come to find out that what I perceive as vegetal character, though, seems to actually be more related to yeast health and yeast quality, and not so much hop. So I'm not sure if any of the times where I've experienced that vegetal character has actually been because of the amount, the size of the dry hop charge.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think the argument is that at some point you just end up with so much plant matter, you're starting to extract, sort of that generic, like you say, chlorophyll, that sort of generic plant-like flavor in there. But
right.
Yeah, it's not something I've ever been blessed with the experience of.
Yeah, for those who have had the opportunity to pick fresh hops off the vine and you pinch them and rub them together or put them between your palms and rub them up and give them a whiff, you kind of have to work around. There are times where you have to kind of work around that green vegetal kind of aroma to really smell the characteristics of that hop. I was, I've mentioned it before. I was lucky enough to be invited up to Hop Harvest by Hopsteiner last year, and hope to make it again this year. It was a lot of fun, where we just went around to all of their farms and we're picking hops just constantly for 2 days straight, right? And they're definitely different. But the one thing they all have in common is sort of that vegetal character. And so it makes sense to me that it would make its way into the beer, and that would be maybe kind of like a ubiquitous thing that all hops contribute. But curiously enough, it doesn't seem to be the case. And in my experience, that vegetal character, kind of like I said before, it's not the same as what I thought I was experiencing in the beers that I thought had that character in the first place. So,
yeah.
So
it's funny you mention that, because one of the things I've noticed is that it is really hard to tell much about a hop with that, put in your hands and sniff method. Just about every hop has a really similar sort of baseline characteristic.
Right.
From one to the next. And they're far more similar from one to the next than they are different. But those differences really seem to come out in beer. And that base character goes away, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't even know. But it's a fascinating thing. And I've talked to a lot of people about this. I was talking with the guys who I was up at Hop Harvest with about how similar they are. and yet how different they come across when used in beer. It's just to me, it always reminds me of how incredibly crazy it is that we use the things that we do to make this delicious beverage today. But that's another episode. So another potential negative side effect of dry hopping that I don't think was considered very often back in the early days of modern dry hopping is I guess, because people have been dry hopping since the early days of IPA and whatnot in England. But where we're at today, this modern version of dry hopping and trying to get as much aroma and flavor, it was never considered that actually increases the level of bitterness of the beer as well.
Yeah, that's something that is pretty interesting, but sort of intuitive when you think of it too. Anybody who's ever grabbed a hold of a hop pellet and stuck it in their mouth to see what it tastes like.
Hold on a
second. They're
bitter. Are you saying that you have just eaten a hot pellet? I've given one to one of my kids because they were curious, but I don't know if I've ever eaten one.
You've never just chewed on a hot pellet?
I can honestly say that I have no recollection of ever chewing on a hot pellet.
Oh yeah, they are, believe it or not, quite bitter.
That's why I've never chewed on one, man.
It doesn't seem surprising to me that it would add some bitterness, even on a minute level, at that dry hop temperature. Rather than boil, we know that the boil extracts those alpha acids and isomerizes them, but it seems reasonable and somewhat intuitive to me that at least some of those compounds in there that are inherently bitter, even without isomerization, are going to be carried over. I mean, you put a bitter thing in another thing, and that other thing is going to become more bitter.
Yeah, right. No, so the first experience I had with this that really got me, I think most homebrewers, probably most brewers in general, were trained along the same lines that you get your bitterness from your 60-minute edition, you get your flavor from your 20 to 40-minute edition, and you get, aroma from 10 minutes or less, and particularly from dry hopping because there's zero isomerization going on. Well, those alpha acids that are in hops that aren't isomerized are still bitter as hell. I mean, and they're there. So when you're adding dry hops to fermented beer, or I guess beer that's in the middle of fermentation in this day of any IPA and biotransformation, it makes sense on an intuitive level. Like you said, I think that you're going to extract some of that bitterness that's there. And it might even be a bitterness of a different quality, right? Than the isomerized version of that alpha acid. But I always assumed, and maybe I sound ignorant here, but up until a certain little experience that I had a couple years ago, I just assumed dry hop was purely for aroma. And then about 2 years ago, I remember it was Thanksgiving. I got really bored. I had some friends over and we were just drinking, and I thought, you know what? I get kind of antsy like this. I went out and I grabbed some leftover Apollo that I had in my garage and in my hop freezer, and pulled that out, and I just made up a little barley tea, and I put a couple of pellets of and it was cold. It was like a cool barley tea that I cooled down all the way to something like it was like 65 degrees. Tossed a couple of hot pellets in there and let it sit for a little bit, and extracted it and filtered it all out through a sieve, and decided to drink this. I thought I was making like a tasty barley tea that was going to be like, oh, it's like a beer without alcohol, basically. Just being stupid. And this, I'm telling you, it was so intolerably bitter. This drink was so grossly bitter that I ended up pouring the whole thing out. But it kind of proved to me at that point, or it got me thinking at least, that perhaps there's something about this idea that I'd accepted, at least, that all, post-boil hop additions don't contribute bitterness. Obviously there was something going on that made this nasty drink super bitter.
To be completely clear here, you gave me a hard time about chewing on a hop pellet, but I'm going to assume in a not completely sober state, decided to make a hopped malt tea as like an after dinner cocktail.
Though. I mean, it wasn't, but I felt like I was, it was like, I thought like somebody who asked for tea, I was like, I can make tea with these grains, cool it down, and then put some hops in there. Yeah, no, you're right. It was stupid. But hey, we've both learned that, hops are bitter regardless of whether they're boiled or not.
That's right. Hey, so Two different paths.
Two different paths, right? And so I think that's one of those things we have to consider with the amount of dry hops we're adding. And it makes me wonder, actually, I think for New England style IPA, the big thing, one of the many big things about it, outside of it being hazy, is minimal bitterness with absolute maximum amount of that tropical, juicy, fruity flavor and aroma. And one of the things, I was talking with somebody who makes these all the time and is kind of trying to perfect their recipe, and what they've come to recently is they add 0 kettle hops. And what they're doing is they're whirlpooling, but they're whirlpooling down at like 165 with a massive amount. We're talking just tons of hops. And then they're hitting at active fermentation, they're hitting it with another bunch of dry hops. And then once fermentation's over and they keg that beer, they're adding more hops to the keg. And I have to believe that they're getting the bitterness that's sort of required for beer to taste like beer from at least in part from those dry hop additions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both experienced beers in the past that were under-bittered, and there's few things less palatable in a beer than one that's not bitter enough in that cloying, sticky, out of balance character.
Yeah, and I feel like the other thing, you've heard the term flabby. I feel like one of the big things with that flabbiness that people experience, at least to me, is it lacking the expected bitterness, which can come from using old hops as your bittering addition, right? Because those alpha acids do degrade over time. It can come from a bunch of other things, just not using enough hops. And so to me, there's definitely something about lacking bitterness, but that's not what I get when I have a well-made, a version of New England style IPA. They always have the right amount of bitterness that makes the beer palatable, but at the same time, they get all of what you would expect from those humongous dry hop additions.
Just how big should those dry hop additions be is really the subject of this experiment I did.
So tell us a little bit about your thinking when it comes up, as you were approaching this experiment. I know you and I talked a little bit about it beforehand.
I just sort of wanted to, that the idea of that diminishing returns, right? At what point does that additional ounce of dry hops just become, money wasted? And quite frankly, one of my big frustrations about IPAs in general, dry hopped heavily in particular, is just the volume losses. With a 6-gallon fermenter, it's, quite frankly, it's just about everything I can do to get even close to a 5-gallon finished volume into a keg. So if 2 ounces of dry hops was to create just as much aroma as 6 ounces of dry hops, that's that much less material that I've got to siphon around in the fermenter when I go to keg that beer, and just can help me, net more beer into the keg.
Yeah, not only net more beer, but I mean, again, save more money. I'm frugal as they come. And, if, for example, our friend Derek Springer from 5bladesbrewing.com, he's known for saying that Galaxy is a cheater hop. But Galaxy is one of those hops that is just immensely expensive, and it costs a lot of money. So if I can get away with using 6 ounces as opposed to, or let's say 4 ounces as opposed to a half a pound or more than that, and I can make more beer with it, not only am I netting more beer because of the absorption in the fermenter, but I'm saving some dough.
Yeah. Even when you're buying some of these hops like Galaxy or Citra or Mosaic or name any of your favorite, like you say, cheater hops that make anything taste good. Even when you're buying those from a great shop like Yakima Valley Hops, it's still between $20 and $30 a pound. When it's all figured out. It is not a minor expense.
No,
in an 11-gallon batch, it's not uncommon to have, a pound and a half or 2 pounds of total hops if you're doing a really heavy dry hop on a big IPA. That's not cheap.
That's not cheap at all. And so the experiment again was to kind of test out whether or not this really needs to be done. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about how he went about performing the experiment, as well as sharing the results of dry hop quantity and the impact it has on beer. If, like me, you prefer the simpler side of brewing beer, you have got to check out the Brew Bag, a food-safe fabric filter that allows for mashing of the finest crushed grain without risking the dreaded stuck sparge. I've been recommending these things since I started using them. They are awesome. The Brew Bag offers the only completely reinforced fabric filter for brewing that can be used over 100 times and comes in sizes that fit most mash tuns, or you can even have one custom made. Go check the Brew Bag out at brewinabag.com and be sure to use promo code TBP17 to get 10% off your order of $30 or more. All right, bladder's empty and beer glasses full. I'm drinking in, because I know we're going to be talking about all of these this hoppy experiment and the dry hopping. I went out and poured myself a Firestone Walker Union Jack, my favorite commercially available and easy to get, at least where I live, IPA. So Ray, when you were thinking about this experiment, kind of give us what was going through your mind and what you were looking for, and let's walk us through the experimental process.
Well, I think primarily I was probably out of IPA in the house, which is a mortal sin here in this house these days. And this was a question I was always curious about. So I took my standard house IPA recipe, which is my MAC, M-A-C-C IPA. Mosaic, Amarillo, Citra, and Centennial is why it's called MAC IPA. And wanted to try with two different dry hop levels. So MAC IPA really simply is a combination of about 80% domestic two-row, 15% Munich malt, and that's a light Munich, and then about 5% of the Gambrinus honey malt. Incidentally, for this recipe in the experiment, I accidentally scaled it incorrectly in Beersmith, so it ended up a little bit off. Ended up being about 80% two-row, 13% Munich, and a whopping 7.1% of the honey malt. But all told, still ended up being a tasty beer. I ferment it with White Lab 090. And I go with a water profile that's about 140 ppm SO4 versus 42 ppm chloride. So a little over 3-to-1.
So like you said, the beer is hopped with Mosaic, Amarillo, Centennial, and Citra. That's where we get MAC from. It looks like people can refer to the website if you want to see this recipe. It's really delicious. I've made it a few times. I've actually tasted on tap Ray's version, and I've had a local friend of mine who made the same recipe as well. It's delicious. Great beer. It's like a first wort hop edition and then a bunch of flame out hops with a 15-minute hop stand. And then comes the dry hop. And I think that...
Yeah, so typically I was brewing this with, sort of in the ballpark of, for a 5.5 gallon batch, I was doing somewhere in the neighborhood of usually about 3 ounces of total dry hop, or about 90 to 100 grams total dry hop. And the idea with the experiment here is to change that up and kind of shoot both sides of that. Shoot one that was lower, like could I save some money, get the same beer with just 60 grams or 2 ounces of dry hop per 5.5 gallons. And then the other one was to just way overshoot and go to 180 grams or, roughly a little bit more than 6 ounces. So a little bit greater than a 1 ounce of dry hop per gallon of beer. And how would that change the character? Was that just throwing money away? Would I just be throwing, that extra hops and the money that was spent on them, in the trash can? Or was that a character that I was actually going to really perceive in that finished beer?
And so you made up the beer and, fermented it out. These two beers, you split a batch of the same exact wort. So that was equal between the two. You fermented them with the same amount of yeast, and you got everything was good. And then you ferment the beers out. And at some point you decide to go and dry hop these beers.
Yeah. So incidentally, 180 grams in a in a 5.5 gallon batch just about filled one of the taster cups. It was just about all I could fit in the solo cups I was using at the time for taste testers.
The most eloquent or elegant of measuring devices, the solo cup.
Absolutely, and a 60 gram or the 2 ounce, as everybody knows, just doesn't look like very much hops at all. So I dumped them in, and the first thing that was recognizable right off the bat, even before I kegged these beers and put them on tap, was just how remarkably different the true blayers were in the fermenters.
Oh my gosh, I'm looking at the picture now, and the 180 gram dry hop looks. I mean, it's amazing how when those dry hops absorb that beer, just how fluffy it gets. I mean, it is easily, almost 3 times as thick as the True Blayer on the 60 gram dry hop.
Yeah, it was just a almost heartbreaking amount of, loss to Trub there in the fermenter. To see all that beer that's just, I know it's trapped, it's trapped inside those hops and whatever other gunk is in there with them, that I can't ever recover that and get to drink it.
But potentially also all of those extra hops in that batch were contributing some very desirable characteristics to the beer. So you take these beers and you keg them up, you carbonate them to the same level. Typically the first observation is clarity of the beers and just the way they present, the appearance of the beers when we pull the first couple of samples off the tap.
Yeah, and to nobody's surprise, the double dry or triple dry hopped in this case beer, with 3 times as much material in it, was noticeably, even after fining with gelatin, was noticeably hazier, to the point that even in the glass it actually looks a little bit lighter in color. The regular, or the 2 ounce dry hop beer was just about brilliant right away.
Yeah, they both look like great, examples of kind of a hoppy, West Coast style IPAs. But the one on the right, the 180 gram dry hop version, almost starts to take on a little bit of that, dare I say, juicy kind of hazy appearance. Maybe just a touch of it, kind of like a New England IPA that's been on tap for a month or something like that.
Yeah, it was just hazy enough that it wouldn't pass as like a lager.
Yeah, right. So then you got these beers and they're done, and it's time to collect data on them. First off, when you were tasting them on your own, did you think you noticed any differences between the beers?
I felt that the one with more dry hops, the heavier dry hop beer, was just more. I think the word I used in the article was saturated. Just that it was the same aroma, but just more of it, if that made sense. And even in the flavor, I felt that there was more, and this could be that interplay between aroma and flavor that happens in our bodies, or in our palates, where what your nose perceives is sort of ends up being perceived, in your taste buds as well. But
yeah, potentially. But I still kind of think that it seems almost impossible that you're not getting some sort of a flavor contribution from the how much more hops you threw at this beer in the dry hop. And I'm looking at your impressions right now on this beer, and you actually used the word, and this was pre, any IPA craze. You used the term an extremely juicy hop aroma. So, right there, you're getting that kind of juice characteristic from this humongous dry hop. While it sounds like the one that was hopped with a third the amount of hops was still very aromatic, but it just didn't have that same level of saturation, that same kind of pungency that you expect in modern IPA.
Yeah, intensity, saturation, those are the words that I use to describe the differences, and I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, I think there really was a difference in flavor too.
Uh-huh.
But I'm also willing to accept that, maybe it wasn't, but
yeah.
But yeah, it had more of that, like that fresh squeezed tropical fruit.
Yeah.
Dripping with character.
So what did you think, before we get into the actual experiment results, you serve this to blind tasters, Did you think it was going to be like an easy one? Did you think people were going to struggle to pick the different one? I mean,
I'm incredibly bad at telling that. I thought that this one was one that would yield significant results, but I didn't necessarily think it was going to be a slam dunk or because, like I say, it was sort of the same aroma, just more of it.
And so what it looks like you did is you went to a homebrew club meeting or something like that, and you had 27 people blindly do triangle tests on these two beers. You served one sample of the beer dry hopped with 180 grams of dry hops and two samples of the beer dry hopped with only 60 grams to 27 people, which would require at minimum 14 people to accurately identify that unique sample, the beer that had the 180 grams.
Yeah, and we ended up with 15, which sounds like it was quote unquote just barely significant. That's not really how these statistics works. That puts it, well into the third digit in terms of precision on the p-value. 15 people getting it right when only 14 were required. I think that, at least in this case, really sort of verified that these beers were different.
Against even my kind of assumption. I mean, I truly thought that, hey, this is going to be the one that proves to us that, carryover from different samples is going to completely jade the participants' ability to actually distinguish the different beer. And it just wasn't true. And 15 out of 27 people, one more than we needed to get to that significance threshold, were able to identify the odd beer out, which suggests that there is a difference between, or a difference caused by a bigger dry hop as compared to a smaller dry hop.
Yeah, I think if I was to, sort of relate this to personal, out at the pub experience, this would be these two beers were the delta between them. Wasn't so much necessarily that if I had drank 2 or 3 of the 180 gram dry hopped beers, and then that third or fourth pint was the other one, I might not necessarily perceive that the keg had changed or whatever, but at the same time, it was enough where I think for me, if I experienced the aroma and the flavor of that 180 gram beer and had that sort of wow saturation of, aroma and hop flavor moment with that beer, that I just wouldn't have had that moment with the other one.
Yeah. So when we get these statistically significant experiment results, what we'll typically do is ask the participants who were correct on the triangle test to complete another survey. It's very brief, basically just identifying they're comparing the two different beers, and then they don't know what's what, they don't know the variable, nothing like that. And we ask them to let us know which one you prefer more. And I think the results from this one are really interesting. Something like there was 15 people who chose who got the triangle test correct, and something like 60% of them chose the 60 gram dry hop batch as their more preferred than the 180 gram dry hop, which isn't much. That just means of the 15, maybe it was 8 versus 7.
Yeah, so pretty much split field in that regard.
Which goes to show, you got these like brewers out there who think that the more hops we throw at it, the better they are. But the populace out there who's drinking these beers may have a different idea when they don't know what's going on. I think more interesting to me on this one, though, is that when those people who were correct, the 15 people who got the triangle test correct, were asked to select the beer that was dry hopped with 180 grams, 13 of them, I mean, a whopping 13 out of 15 accurately selected the one that was really dry hopped with 180 grams of hop.
Yes, staggering, really. And I think that speaks a little bit too. I mean, I know at least a couple of the guys that tasted this from my homebrew club are not guys who like IPAs per se, are not guys who like hops. And so they would choose the 60 gram dry hop. I don't know, obviously, what each individual chose, but they would choose the 60 because it had less hops and they preferred that.
Yeah.
I suspect if I'm, maybe this is just imparting my own bias though too, but I suspect that those of the people that would self-identify as IPA lovers, would have been in that preference bracket of preferring the heavier dry hopped beer.
Oh, sure. And I've, since this experiment, this was almost 2 years ago now, I know that I've definitely taken to dry hopping my IPA with much more hops. And, I've not compared them the way you did in this one, but I've been more pleased with it. I have to believe the same is true for you. Am I wrong?
Yeah, well, it depends on the beer. I pretty much won't go below about 4 ounces of dry hops in a, in a five nominally 5 gallon batch of beer.
Right.
And now, interestingly, just because of the losses, I haven't really experimented much with dry hop rates, in excess of, of that, gallon per ounce or ounce per gallon sort of metric, which is something I really sort of want to try. It's obviously it's quite expensive, and then you start putting 12 ounces of dry hops in a 5.5 gallon beer, you don't end up with 5.5 gallons of beer. You end up with like 3 1/4 into the keg.
Right. Right.
Which can be interesting, but it really cuts down on the drinkage.
Yeah, no joke. Well, I do think that this experiment and ones that we've got planned for the future to test out the impact that different quantities of dry hops have on beer really was kind of eye-opening and helped to support this idea that, and there are New England IPA and West Coast IPA brewers who are latching on to more hops equals more hop aroma and more hop character. And at the very least, what we can say is that it leads to a different beer. And I think that's pretty cool. Is there anything else you want to say about dry hop quantity?
No, other than it, I just having this conversation has got me inspired to take one of my, the SS Brewtech buckets, because they are bigger than the fermenters I used to use, and just really overload it with dry hops and see how that...
Just really how much character you can get out of it.
Just brew a slightly oversized batch. Put 7 gallons into the fermenter and lose 1.5 gallons and not care.
Yeah, right. I like that idea. Well, hey, that was a lot of fun. Hops obviously are just a cool thing for brewers to talk about, and we love them. And beer wouldn't be beer without them. So testing this stuff out is always really exciting. Well, thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Brewlosophy Podcast. If you have any questions and that you want answered on a future Brew and A episode, make sure that you email me at marshall@brewlosophy.com, or if you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, you can ask us there too. If you like what we're doing here and you want more of it, head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can help us out. And don't forget to check out the rewards you can get for supporting us at patreon.com/brewlosophy. We'll be back soon with the next episode of the Brewlosophy Podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.